Colin Tennant, Lord Glenconner, was Princess Margaret's wildest friend. He built a private Caribbean empire to escape British law and host elite bisexual orgies. Yet his true legacy isn't the island's hedonism. It is his final revenge, a calculated deathbed legal strike designed to financially annihilate his own family. The roots of this aristocratic tragedy lie deeply within the suffocating confines of the British upper class in the mid-20th century. Born in 1926 into the staggering wealth of the Tennant family, whose fortune was forged in industrial chemicals and vast Scottish estates, Colin Christopher Paget Tennant was never meant to be ordinary. He inherited a world where the stiff upper lip was not just a cultural trope, but a vital mechanism for survival. It was an era where reputation was paramount, where societal rules were rigid, and where any deviation from the heterosexual, dutiful norm was met with severe social ostracization, and in many cases criminal prosecution. Colin was fiercely intelligent, blindingly charismatic, and profoundly volatile. He harbored appetites and eccentricities that London society could never contain. The traditional path of an English peer, managing estates, attending the House of Lords, and fading quietly into respected old age, felt like a death sentence to a man whose ego demanded constant theatrical validation. In 1956, he executed what appeared to be the perfect aristocratic maneuver by marrying Lady Anne Coke. She was the quintessential blue-blooded bride. As the daughter of the Earl of Leicester and a former maid of honor to Queen Elizabeth II at her 1953 coronation, Lady Anne represented the absolute apex of respectable British society. Their union seemed to secure the Tennant legacy. To the outside world, they were a golden couple, perfectly poised to rule over London's high society. But beneath the veneer of morning suits and grand ballrooms, the foundation of their marriage was already fracturing. Colin possessed a dark, erratic temper, a symptom of what many later recognized as severe narcissistic personality disorder. He required absolute subservience and endless attention. More critically, he harbored a deep, conflicted bisexuality that the polite drawing rooms of Mayfair forced him to ruthlessly suppress. The pressure of this suppression, combined with his immense wealth, created a volatile psychological powder keg. He needed an outlet. He needed a place where the laws of England, both legal and social, could not reach him. 2 years into his marriage in 1958, Colin Tennant found his escape route. For the seemingly trivial sum of £45,000, he purchased Mustique, a tiny comma-shaped island in the West Indies. At the time, it was a desolate, sun-baked rock. It possessed no running water, no electricity, no natural harbor, and no landing strip. It was infested with mosquitoes and wild livestock. His peers in London viewed the acquisition as an act of sheer lunacy. But Colin did not see a barren rock. He saw a blank canvas. He saw a sovereign territory where he could be king. He poured his vast family fortune into the island, relentlessly driving the construction of infrastructure, roads, and eccentric villas. This monumental effort was not merely a real estate venture. It was the construction of a fortress designed to protect and indulge his most famous and vulnerable friend. Since the early 1950s, Colin had cultivated an intense, uniquely intimate friendship with Princess Margaret. She was the glamorous, rebellious sister of the Queen, a woman famously trapped in a gilded cage, torn between her royal duties and her desperate desire for personal freedom. Colin understood her captivity because he felt it himself. He offered her Mustique as a sanctuary. As a wedding present, he gifted her a plot of land where she built her legendary villa, Les Jolies Eaux. With the arrival of the princess, Mustique was instantly transformed from an obscure Caribbean outpost into the most exclusive, heavily guarded playground on the planet. Colin established strict, unwritten laws for his island kingdom. Privacy was absolute, the paparazzi were violently repelled, and the conventional moral codes of mainland Britain were entirely suspended. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, as the world outside underwent cultural revolutions, Mustique became a theater of unparalleled decadence. Colin curated a guest list that violently smashed the old aristocracy into the new royalty of rock and roll. Princess Margaret mingled with Mick Jagger and David Bowie. Dukes and earls drank rum with fashion icons and artists. But Lord Glenconner was not merely a host, he was a ringmaster of chaos. He organized hedonistic multi-day parties that defied belief. Guests were commanded to abandon their tailored suits and ball gowns for loincloths, elaborate masks, and frequently nothing at all. Eyewitness accounts speak of nights where attendees were covered entirely in gold body paint, engaging in tribal dances and primal rituals under the Caribbean stars. It was a calculated, deliberate stripping away of civilized restraint. Colin reveled in the shock value, pushing the boundaries of taste and sanity simply because he had the money and the power to force the global elite to play along. Yet, this utopian freedom was deeply sinister. The island allowed Colin to stop hiding his bisexuality, but he weaponized his newly unleashed desires. He openly paraded beautiful young male lovers, often drawn from the local island population or his own staff, in front of his high society guests and most cruelly in front of his wife. He used his sexuality not just as an expression of freedom, but as a tool for public humiliation. In the dining rooms of Mustique, while Princess Margaret looked on, Colin would lavish attention on his male companions while actively ignoring or verbally degrading Lady Anne. The island was a sanctuary for the elite, but it was a meticulously designed prison of psychological torment for the woman he had sworn to love. Lady Anne's endurance throughout this era stands as a testament to both the strength and the tragic stoicism of the British aristocratic woman. In her profound and searingly honest 2019 memoir, Lady in Waiting, she detailed the daily agony of living with a man who treated her as little more than a convenient prop in his grand chaotic play. She was frequently subjected to his explosive, terrifying rages. He would scream at her, belittle her intelligence, and completely exclude her from his emotional life. When he brought his lovers into their bedchamber, she was expected to maintain a polite, aristocratic silence. She was bound by a deep sense of duty to her title, her family name, and the societal expectation that a baroness does not complain. She swallowed her pride and her pain, adopting a hardened shell of resilience just to survive the daily emotional violence of her husband's narcissism. This suffering was exponentially compounded by unimaginable family tragedy. Behind the glittering facade of their immense wealth, the Tennant family was cursed. Of Colin and Anne's 5 children, tragedy claimed a devastating toll. Their eldest son, Charlie, developed a severe heroin addiction and died of hepatitis C. Their second son, Henry, openly embraced his homosexuality but tragically fell victim to the AIDS epidemic, dying in 1990. Their third son, Christopher, suffered a catastrophic motorcycle accident that left him with severe brain damage, requiring lifelong care. In the face of these crushing consecutive nightmares, Lady Anne was left to shoulder the burden of grief and caregiving almost entirely alone. Colin, consumed by his own pursuit of pleasure and utterly incapable of facing reality, emotionally abandoned his family when they needed him most. He remained in his Caribbean fantasy, insulating himself from the stench of death and the hard work of parental grief, further cementing his reputation as a man utterly devoid of human empathy. The inevitable consequence of Colin's reckless megalomania was financial ruin. A kingdom built on extravagance cannot sustain itself when the king views his treasury as infinite. Colin spent millions, not just on the physical development of Mustique, but on sustaining an unsustainable lifestyle of private jets, bespoke eccentricities, and endless parties. By the late 1990s, the tenant fortune, once considered virtually inexhaustible, was largely gone. His erratic behavior and financial mismanagement forced him into a corner. In a humiliating defeat, he was ousted from the board of the Mustique Company and forced to sell his controlling interests in the very island he had birthed. The elite society he had cultivated turned its back on him when the money dried up. Angry, bitter, and feeling profoundly betrayed by the world he had created, Colin Tennant packed up the remnants of his life and went into a self-imposed exile on the neighboring, far less glamorous island of St. Lucia. It was here, in the twilight of his life, stripped of his total power, and facing the harsh reality of his own mortality, that Colin's story veered into its most bizarre and ultimately devastating chapter, living in a relatively modest estate nestled between the volcanic pitons of St. Lucia. The former Lord of Mustique became increasingly isolated. His marriage to Lady Anne existed only on paper. They lived entirely separate lives. His surviving children and grandchildren were estranged, alienated by decades of his neglect and cruelty. In this void, Colin sought a new audience. He impulsively purchased an Indian elephant named Bupa, shipping the massive animal to his St. Lucian estate. To care for the beast, he hired a local man named Kent Adonai. Kent Adonai was an uneducated working-class St. Lucian. He was entirely removed from the aristocratic games of London and the hedonistic history of Mustique. His job was simply to feed the elephant, clean its enclosure, and ensure it didn't trample the estate. Yet, a profound and complex dynamic developed between the decaying baron and the quiet local worker. As Colin's health rapidly declined due to aggressive prostate cancer, Kent transitioned from an animal keeper to a personal valet, a chauffeur, a confidant, and constant companion. For a narcissist facing the terrifying prospect of death, Kent provided the one thing Colin's family could no longer offer: uncomplicated, unquestioning reverence. Kent did not judge him for his past failures. Kent did not carry the baggage of the deceased tenant children. Kent simply served the Lord. And for Colin Tennant, this servitude became the ultimate validation of his own distorted self-worth. In the summer of 2010, knowing he had only weeks to live, the third Baron Glenconner orchestrated his final masterstroke of cruelty. He contacted his lawyers and quietly, deliberately rewrote his last will and testament. He kept this final betrayal entirely hidden from his wife, his severely disabled son, and his young grandson Cody, the legal heir to the fourth Baron Glenconner title. On August 27, 2010, Colin Tennant died at the age of 83. The family, despite all the decades of abuse and estrangement, gathered with a sense of solemn duty, expecting the traditional passing of the estate. They expected that whatever remnants of the Tennant millions remained, the St. Lucian properties, the art, the offshore accounts, would naturally flow to the legal heir to support the historic title and to provide care for his severely disabled son. The reading of the will struck the British establishment with the force of a physical blow. The document revealed that Colin Tennant had explicitly, aggressively disinherited his entire bloodline. He left absolutely nothing to Lady Anne, the woman who had suffered his infidelities and rages for half a century. He left nothing to Christopher, the son who required round-the-clock medical care. He left nothing to Cody, handing the boy an ancient aristocratic title that now carried the bitter taste of total bankruptcy. Instead, every single liquid asset, every piece of real estate, every final drop of the Tennant legacy, a sum estimated in the millions of pounds, was left unconditionally and entirely to Kent Adonai, the keeper of the elephant. It was an act of breathtaking malice. It was not a gesture of charitable love toward a loyal servant. It was a weaponized document designed to inflict maximum pain from beyond the grave. By handing his fortune to Kent, Colin delivered a final calculated insult to the rigid class system he both benefited from and despised. He proved that a lifetime of aristocratic duty, legal ties, and even the shared trauma of losing children meant absolutely nothing to him. He used his death to ensure that his family would suffer the ultimate humiliation, seeing their ancestral wealth handed to a stranger while they were left to publicly beg for scraps. It sparked vicious legal battles as the family attempted to overturn the will, citing Colin's mental instability. But the courts eventually upheld the Baron's right to dispose of his property exactly as he saw fit. Kent Adonai became a millionaire, eventually selling off the St. Lucian estate, while the fourth Baron Glenconner inherited a hollow name. We look at the legacy of the Lord of Mustique and we see the absolute fragility of the human experience. We see that immense wealth does not build character. It merely amplifies whatever is already there. Colin Tennant possessed a fortune that could have built a lasting, noble legacy. Instead, he used his millions to construct an island where he could hide his shame, to buy the company of beautiful people who abandoned him, and ultimately to enact a petty, vicious revenge against the only people who actually stayed. He died believing he had won the final argument. But the enduring lesson of Lord Glenconner is far darker and far more profound. A man can buy an island. He can buy the loyalty of an elephant keeper, and he can buy the silence of high society. But all the gold in the world cannot purchase a soul, and it cannot save a man from the terrifying emptiness of his own heart. The silence that followed the reading of Colin Tennant's final will was not the dignified, mournful quiet of aristocratic tradition. It was the suffocating, ringing silence of total devastation. In the mahogany-paneled offices of London lawyers and the sun-bleached rooms of St. Lucia, the surviving members of the Tennant family were forced to absorb the impossible. The third Baron Glenconner, a man who had commanded the attention of monarchs and the wealth of an empire, had effectively legally erased them. He had not merely written them out of a fortune. He had fired a parting shot meant to echo through the generations, ensuring that his family name would be inextricably linked to a public humiliating destitution. The immediate casualty of this post-mortem cruelty was his grandson, Cody Tennant. At just 20 years old, a student quietly reading history at Edinburgh University, Cody was suddenly thrust into the glaring spotlight of the British tabloid press. He had inherited the title, becoming the fourth Baron Glenconner. In previous centuries, this elevation would have come with sprawling Scottish estates, immense political influence, and a treasury of liquid wealth. Instead, Cody inherited a ghost. He was handed a title heavy with the weight of history, but completely stripped of the capital required to sustain it. The bitter irony was palpable. The new Lord Glenconner, an aristocrat by blood and law, found himself holding a hollow title stripped of its ancestral capital, while the family's remaining millions sat in the bank account of an elephant keeper thousands of miles away. It was a brutal initiation into adulthood, a stark realization that the blood flowing in his veins meant absolutely nothing to the man who had sired his father. Naturally, the British aristocracy does not surrender without a fight, particularly when money and pride are at stake. The shock quickly mutated into a desperate, ferocious legal war. The Tennant family, galvanized by the sheer injustice of the situation, launched a formidable challenge against the will in the St. Lucian courts. Their primary weapon was the assertion that Colin, in his final months, was not of sound mind. They painted a picture of an eccentric man driven mad by advanced prostate cancer and heavy medication, a frail patriarch who had been unduly influenced or perhaps manipulated by the only person physically present at his bedside. They argued that a man in his right mind, a peer of the realm, would never consciously choose to leave his severely disabled son, Christopher, without the financial means for his lifelong medical care. They demanded that the court recognize the will as the product of dementia, not defiance, but proving madness in a man who had spent his entire life behaving like a madman is a near impossible legal paradox. How do you argue that disinheriting your family is an act of insanity when you have spent the last 50 years riding elephants in gold paint, burning through millions on tropical orgies, and publicly humiliating your wife? Colin's lawyers, representing the estate now controlled by Kent Adonai, countered with a chillingly simple defense. Colin Tennant was not crazy. He was just remarkably vindictive. They argued that the will was entirely consistent with a man who had always lived by his own extreme, narcissistic rules. He knew exactly what he was doing. The courts were presented with the uncomfortable reality that absolute selfishness is not a medical condition. It is a choice. And in the eyes of the law, a man has the right to make the cruelest choice imaginable with his own property. At the center of this storm stood Kent Adonai. The British press painted him in various shades of suspicion, either as a scheming opportunist who had whispered poison into a dying man's ear, or as a bewildered innocent who had accidentally won a lottery ticket drawn in hell. The reality of Kent was far more grounded. He was a working-class man who had shown up to do a bizarre job, caring for a pet elephant named Bupa, and had ended up becoming the sole emotional anchor for an exiled king. Kent maintained a stoic, often impenetrable silence during the early days of the legal assault. He did not ask for the Tennant millions, but once they were given to him by the man he had dutifully served, he refused to simply hand them back to a family that had, from his perspective, abandoned their patriarch in his dying days. For Kent, the money was a validation of his loyalty. For the tenants, his possession of it was an ongoing desecration of their ancestry. The battlefield itself was a decaying monument to Colin's hubris. The St. Lucian estate, nestled dramatically between the towering volcanic peaks of the Petons, was a shadow of the glory he had built on Mustique. It was a bizarre, eclectic compound, filled with imported Asian artifacts, crumbling tropical architecture, and of course the elephant. It was a physical manifestation of Colin's desperate need to recreate the kingdom he had lost. As the legal bills mounted on both sides, this final estate began to bleed its value. The millions left behind were not neatly stacked in a vault. They were tied up in property, art, and the complex, messy business of untangling an eccentric billionaire's chaotic bookkeeping. The family found themselves burning their own meager resources to fight for an inheritance that was slowly evaporating under the heat of legal fees. While the lawyers argued over the definition of sanity in a Caribbean courtroom, Lady Anne Tennant watched the spectacle unfold with the same quiet, agonizing dignity she had practiced for 50 years. She absorbed the shock with cold composure. She understood, perhaps better than the lawyers or the press, that fighting Colin was a losing game, even after his death. He had designed this final scenario explicitly to torture them, to force them to beg for their own money in front of the world. By engaging in the legal battle, the family was, in a twisted way, still dancing to Lord Glenconner's tune. He was still controlling them from the grave, pulling the strings of their finances and their emotions, just as he had done when he was alive. This war over the will ripped the veil off the polite society of the British upper class. The public watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as an ancient family tore itself to pieces over the scraps left behind by a megalomaniac. It forced a conversation about the nature of inheritance itself. Does blood automatically entitle one to wealth? Is a family legacy a right, or is it a fragile construct that can be annihilated by a single hateful signature? Colin Tennant had weaponized his death to prove that the old rules no longer applied. He had burned down the house on his way out, leaving his heirs to choke on the smoke and sift through the ashes for anything of value. The ashes of the Tennant legacy were not just blowing across the Caribbean. They were settling over the drawing rooms of London, forcing a profound and uncomfortable reckoning among the British elite. While the tabloids feasted on the scandalous details of the Elephant Keeper's inheritance, the upper echelons of society, the dukes, the earls, the royal confidants, responded with a chilling, collective silence. This silence was not born of respect for the dead. It was born of complicity. For decades, this very same establishment had happily accepted Lord Glenconner's invitations, drank his vintage champagne, and turned a blind eye to his escalating madness. They had enabled the monster, and now they were terrified of the mess he had left behind. To truly understand how Colin Tennant was allowed to wield such destructive power over his own family, one must examine the ultimate shield he carried, the unconditional patronage of the royal family. Princess Margaret was not just a guest on Mustique. She was the gravitational center of Colin's universe, and his ultimate trump card against societal consequences. In the rigidly hierarchical world of the mid-20th century, proximity to the crown granted a man a terrifying degree of immunity. Because the Queen's sister was dancing at his parties, swimming in his waters and relying on his absolute discretion. The normal rules of human decency were suspended for Lord Glenconner. The elite flocked to Mustique not just for the sun, but for the intoxicating, dangerous thrill of rubbing shoulders with royalty in a lawless environment. Colin understood this dynamic with the predatory instinct of a true narcissist. He weaponized his royal connections to insulate himself from any criticism of his private life. If a guest expressed discomfort at the sight of the Baron openly parading his young male lovers, or if they winced at the public, vicious dressing downs he administered to his wife, they were quickly reminded of the stakes. To challenge Colin Tennant on his own island was to risk expulsion from the inner circle of the princess herself. And so, the British aristocracy, famous for its rigid moral codes and strict propriety, checked their consciences at the door. They laughed at his cruel jokes. They participated in his degrading, hypersexualized costume parties, and they implicitly validated his behavior. By drinking his wine, they endorsed his cruelty. This collective turning of a blind eye created a psychological prison for Lady Anne that was far more suffocating than the physical boundaries of the island. It is one thing to be abused by your husband in private. It is a uniquely agonizing hell to be humiliated by him in front of the most powerful people in the world, only to have them look through you as if you do not exist. Anne was stranded in a crowded room. She was required to play the gracious hostess, to ensure the silver was polished and the royal protocols were observed, while the man she married actively dismantled her dignity. She watched as her husband transformed their tropical home into a theater of the absurd, where traditional morality was mocked and raw, uninhibited ego was celebrated as genius. The parties on Mustique during its zenith were not mere celebrations. They were exercises in dominance. Colin orchestrated events that were designed to disorient and subjugate his guests. He demanded total submission to his creative whims. He would construct elaborate, temporary palaces of bamboo and palm fronds, only to burn them to the ground at dawn. He forced dignified statesmen and aging aristocrats into absurd, revealing costumes, stripping them of their societal armor and reducing them to vulnerable players in his private chaotic drama. And in the center of this swirling vortex of wealth, drugs, and performative sexuality stood Colin, the undisputed puppet master, extracting loyalty and submission from everyone who stepped onto his sand. Everyone, that is, except the one woman he could not completely break. Lady Anne's survival strategy was a masterclass in the terrible quiet strength of the aristocratic woman. She retreated into the impenetrable fortress of duty. Her role as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Margaret was not just a royal appointment. It became her psychological armor. A lady-in-waiting is trained to anticipate needs, to blend into the background, to remain entirely unruffled by crisis, and above all, to never, ever show a crack in the facade. Anne applied this training to her marriage. When Colin raged, she remained perfectly still. When he flaunted his infidelity, she looked straight ahead. She internalized the trauma, bearing it beneath a polished exterior of impeccable manners and unwavering loyalty to the crown. It was a brutal way to live, a slow asphyxiation of the soul, but it was the only way she could protect her children and preserve the fragile remnants of her own sanity. But while Anne was busy holding the emotional fabric of the family together, Colin was systematically destroying their material foundation. The creation of Mustique was a monumental financial undertaking, but it was the maintenance of Colin's ego that truly bankrupted the Tennant dynasty. He treated the family trust funds not as a legacy to be preserved, but as a bottomless well drawn to water his illusions. He bought properties he never visited, commissioned art he never looked at, and funded the lavish lifestyles of a rotating cast of sycophants and lovers who fed his vanity. He confused the power of creation with the delusion of invincibility. He believed that because he had carved a paradise out of a barren rock, the laws of economics, much like the laws of morality, simply did not apply to him. The tragedy of the Tennant fortune is that it did not disappear in a single catastrophic crash. It bled out slowly, a death by 1,000 extravagant cuts. The accountant's ledgers from the 1980s and 1990s tell a story of a man entirely disconnected from reality. Millions of pounds were liquidated to pay off mounting debts, yet Colin refused to alter his lifestyle by a single degree. When the board of the Mustique Company, the very entity he had created, finally recognized that their founder was a financial liability, the betrayal Colin felt was absolute. The men in the gray suits, the pragmatists who actually understood money, forced him to sell his remaining shares. He was exiled from his own Eden, cast out not by a flaming sword, but by a balance sheet. This financial and social exile is the crucial context for the final poisoned will. When Colin Tennant retreated to St. Lucia, he was a wounded, dangerous animal. He had lost his island, he had squandered his fortune, and he had alienated the high society that once worshipped him. The only things he had left were his title, his simmering rage, and the unquestioning loyalty of a man who cared for his elephant. As the cancer ate away at his body, the bitterness ate away at whatever was left of his mind. He looked back at his life and saw a family that had survived his worst abuses, a wife who had maintained her dignity while he lost his, and a society that had moved on without him. The decision to leave everything to Kent Adonai was the final logical conclusion of a life lived entirely for self-gratification. It was not a lapse in judgment. It was the ultimate expression of his character. He could not bear the thought that the people who had witnessed his failures, his wife, his sons, his grandson, would inherit the last scraps of his power. He would rather burn the remaining millions and hand the ashes to a stranger than admit that his family had outlasted him. The St. Lucia courtroom battle was exactly what he wanted. He wanted them fighting over the ruins. He wanted the world to see his family reduced to beggars at the gates of an estate owned by a servant. He wanted his final act on earth to be a reminder that Lord Glenconner, even from the grave, was still the only one who dictated the terms of surrender. For Kent Adonai, inheriting the Tennant fortune was less like winning the lottery and more like catching a falling knife. Overnight, the quiet, unassuming St. Lucian found himself thrust into a vicious transatlantic legal war that he possessed neither the training nor the desire to fight. He was a man accustomed to the tangible realities of physical labor, hauling feed, repairing fences, and managing the colossal weight of an Indian elephant. Suddenly, he was forced to navigate the abstract, high-stakes world of asset freezes, probate law, and injunctions filed by some of the most expensive barristers in London. The British press descended on the St. Lucian estate, desperate to capture an image of the newly minted millionaire. They found a man who looked profoundly out of place in his own narrative. Kent did not immediately adopt the trappings of wealth. He continued to wear his simple work clothes. He continued to tend to the elephant, and he maintained a stoic, guarded perimeter around his sudden inheritance. To the tenant family, his refusal to surrender the money was an act of profound insolence. But from Kent's perspective, the money was a sacred trust, a final command from a dying master who had felt utterly abandoned by his own blood. Handing the estate back to London would have been a betrayal of the only man who had elevated him from obscurity. Yet, the inheritance was a poisoned chalice. The millions Lord Glenconner had technically left behind were not neatly organized stacks of cash waiting in an offshore account. They were hopelessly tangled in the chaotic, eccentric financial architecture of a man who had treated accounting with the same disdain he treated his marriage vows. The St. Lucian estate itself was a rapidly depreciating asset. Colin had built it with the frantic energy of an exiled king trying to recreate his lost empire, but without the bottomless funds he once possessed. The buildings were susceptible to the harsh Caribbean climate. The imported art required specialized care, and the daily operational costs of the compound, let alone the staggering expense of feeding a fully grown elephant, began to rapidly drain whatever liquid assets Kent could access. While the lawyers bled the estate dry with their hourly fees, a stark geographical contrast began to emerge, highlighting the total erasure of Colin Tennant's legacy. 200 miles away, the island of Mustique was entering a new era. The wild, lawless playground that Colin had carved out of the jungle had been entirely sanitized. The corporate board that had ousted him successfully transformed the island into a highly regulated, ultra-exclusive, and profoundly boring sanctuary for tech billionaires and hedge fund managers. The wild orgies and gold-painted bodies were replaced by green juice, early morning yoga, and aggressively enforced noise ordinances. It became a place where a man like Colin Tennant, with his volatile temper and desperate need for public spectacle, would not only be unwelcome, but likely arrested. He had birthed the island, but the island had evolved into a sterile entity that actively rejected its creator's DNA. Meanwhile, the St. Lucian estate, the physical manifestation of Colin's final bitter years, began to rot. The legal freeze on the assets meant that Kent could not sell the property, nor could he afford the massive upkeep required to stop the jungle from reclaiming it. Paint peeled from the exotic pavilions. The manicured lawns grew wild. The elephant, Bupa, became a tragic symbol of the entire debacle. A massive displaced creature pacing its enclosure, requiring constant care that the estate could barely provide. It was a visual metaphor for the Tennant legacy, outsized, out of place, and slowly starving to death while the people responsible for it argued in a courtroom. For the Tennant family, the agonizingly slow pace of the Caribbean legal system was a second trauma. They were fighting a war of attrition, and they were losing. The initial shock and righteous anger that had fueled their legal challenge began to give way to a cold, exhausting reality. The law, they discovered, is not a mechanism for enforcing moral decency. It does not care if a father is a narcissist. It does not care if a husband is abusive. And it does not care if a bloodline is humiliated. The law only cares about the validity of a signature and the presence of a witness. The burden of proof lay entirely on the family to demonstrate that Colin was legally insane when he signed the document. This proved to be an insurmountable hurdle. The lawyers for Kent Adonai successfully argued that while Lord Glenconner was undoubtedly eccentric, vindictive, and cruel, he possessed a razor-sharp understanding of exactly what he was doing. They produced witnesses from his final weeks, doctors, local officials, and acquaintances, who testified that Colin was lucid, articulate, and completely unrepentant about his intentions. He had explicitly stated his desire to leave his family with nothing, driven by a deeply ingrained paranoid belief that they had plotted against him during his financial downfall. The courts were forced to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. Colin Tennant was not suffering from dementia. He was suffering from an acute case of absolute selfishness, and there is no law against being a terrible person. The legal war dragged on for years, burning through both sides' resources. Ultimately, an out-of-court settlement was reached in the mid-2000s, granting the family a fraction of the remaining estate. However, the emotional defeat was absolute. Cody Tennant, the fourth Baron Glenconner, was left holding an aristocratic title deeply scarred by public humiliation and drastically stripped of its historical wealth, a constant reminder of his grandfather's ultimate betrayal. He returned to his life a young man, forced to forge a path completely devoid of the privilege that his name historically guaranteed. Christopher, the severely disabled son, was left reliant entirely on the care of his mother and whatever state assistance could be secured, completely abandoned by the vast fortune his father had once commanded. In the immediate aftermath of this total defeat, the British establishment expected Lady Anne to finally crumble. They expected her to retreat into the shadows, a tragic, broken figure who had endured 50 years of abuse only to be publicly robbed at the finish line. They severely underestimated her. While the men in her family had been fighting over the physical scraps of the estate, Anne had been quietly recognizing a different reality. The money was gone. The island was gone. The social protection of the royal family following the death of Princess Margaret years earlier was gone. But in losing everything, Anne realized she had also lost the one thing that had kept her paralyzed for half a century. She had lost her obligations. She no longer had to protect the reputation of the third Baron Glenconner. She no longer had to maintain the polite fiction of a functional marriage. She no longer had to sit in silence while the society that had enabled her husband whispered about her misfortune. The ultimate betrayal of the will had snapped the final chain of duty that bound her to Colin's mythology. Stripped of her wealth, she was finally armed with something far more dangerous. She possessed the truth. She had a photographic memory of every party, every betrayal, every screaming match, and every royal secret that had transpired on the beaches of Mustique and in the drawing rooms of London. At the age of 87, Lady Anne Tennant sat down to write. Approaching her own life with the detached precision of a historian analyzing a war zone, she meticulously documented the reality of her survival. She detailed the specific mechanics of Colin's emotional abuse, the agonizing deaths of her children, and the suffocating complicity of the British upper class. She was preparing to burn down the false legacy her husband had spent his life trying to build, using the unvarnished truth. When Lady Anne Tennant put pen to paper, She did not write with the frantic, messy energy of a woman seeking vengeance. She wrote with the chilling, surgical precision of a survivor who had spent a lifetime observing her captor. Her memoir, Lady in Waiting, released in 2019, was widely anticipated by the British public as a polite, nostalgic peek behind the velvet ropes of the royal family. Readers expected charming anecdotes about Princess Margaret, descriptions of royal wardrobes, and perhaps a few sanitized tales of the glamorous parties on Mustique. What they received instead was a psychological earthquake. Anne delivered a master class in the destructive power of the unvarnished truth, using the very British reserve that had once silenced her as the ultimate weapon of exposure. The brilliance of her narrative lay in its lack of self-pity. She did not cast herself as a weeping martyr, nor did she scream at the reader about the injustice of her disinheritance. Instead, she laid out the facts of her life with a detached, almost journalistic clarity. She described the gold-painted orgies, the public humiliations, the violent outbursts, and the parade of male lovers with the same measured tone she used to describe a change in the Caribbean weather. This deliberate understatement made the horror of her reality infinitely more devastating. By refusing to dramatize the events, she forced the reader to confront the raw, unmitigated cruelty of Colin Tennant's behavior without any emotional buffer. She simply presented the monster exactly as he was, stripped of the eccentric charm and aristocratic bluster that had shielded him for decades. The impact was instantaneous and absolute. The book rocketed to the top of the bestseller lists across the globe, striking a profound chord with readers who recognized the universal dynamics of coercive control and narcissism beneath the glittering aristocratic surface. Overnight, the public paradigm shifted completely. For 50 years, the media and the upper classes had conspired to portray Lord Glenconner as a roguish visionary, a brilliant eccentric whose excesses were the acceptable price of his genius. Anne's book shattered that mythology permanently. He was instantly demoted from a pioneer of paradise to a domestic tyrant. The Lord of the Isle was exposed as a petty, vicious man who used his vast fortune to terrorize the people who were legally and morally bound to him. This sudden, brutal recalibration of Colin's legacy sent shock waves through the surviving members of the British establishment. The same aristocrats and socialites who had eagerly accepted his hospitality, who had laughed at his cruel jokes and ignored his wife's silent suffering, were suddenly faced with their own complicity. Anne's memoir did not explicitly name and shame the silent enablers, but their guilt was heavily implied in every chapter. She exposed the toxic core of the class system, a system that prioritized the protection of a wealthy, titled man over the physical and emotional safety of his family. The society that had turned its back on her when Colin stripped her of her inheritance was now forced to look her in the eye and acknowledge the hell they had helped maintain. As Anne's star rose, illuminating the darkest corners of her marriage, the hollow reality of Colin's final revenge began to fully manifest across the Atlantic. In St. Lucia, Kent Adonai was learning the hard lesson that inheriting a narcissist's estate is not a blessing. It is an administrative nightmare. The millions of pounds that the public imagined sitting in Kent's bank account simply did not exist in liquid form. Lord Glenconner had not left behind a neat portfolio of easily accessible wealth. He had left behind a sprawling, decaying property, a mountain of unresolved legal fees, and a chaotic web of offshore trusts that required teams of expensive forensic accountants to untangle. The supposed fortune was essentially trapped behind a wall of legal and bureaucratic red tape, inaccessible to the man who legally owned it. Kent found himself land rich but cash poor, burdened with the massive daily operating costs of an estate that was built for a billionaire, but now belonged to a working-class caretaker. The property taxes, the maintenance of the imported architecture in a harsh tropical climate, and the sheer cost of keeping the lights on began to drain whatever meager resources he had. He was trapped in the ruins of his former master's ego. The ultimate symbol of this absurd predicament was Bupa, the elephant. A fully grown Indian elephant requires hundreds of pounds of specialized food every single day, along with constant veterinary care and massive infrastructure. Bupa transformed from a whimsical, aristocratic pet into a crushing financial liability. Kent, a man who had shown genuine loyalty to Colin, was rewarded with the immense, stressful burden of keeping a displaced leviathan alive on a bankrupt estate. Eventually, the pressure became unsustainable. To pay the lawyers who had defended his inheritance and to simply survive the daily costs of the property, Kent was forced to start dismantling the estate piece by piece. He began selling off the art, the antique furniture, and the various eclectic treasures Colin had hoarded over the decades. The St. Lucian compound, which Colin had envisioned as his final, enduring monument, was slowly liquidated to pay for its own survival. It was a tragicomic end to the tenant fortune. The wealth that had taken generations of Scottish industrialists to build, and that Colin had aggressively weaponized against his own flesh and blood, was ending up in the pockets of Caribbean auctioneers and London probate lawyers. The great revenge plot had effectively bankrupted the victor. Meanwhile, a profound and deeply satisfying irony was unfolding in London. Lady Anne Tennant, the woman who had been publicly stripped of every penny of her ancestral wealth, was quietly becoming a millionaire on her own terms. The massive global success of her memoir, followed by subsequent books and speaking tours, generated a substantial independent fortune. She did not need the Glenconner Trust Fund. She did not need the St. Lucian estate. She had monetized the very trauma her husband had inflicted upon her, turning the pain he used to break her into the capital that secured her absolute independence. This financial triumph was the ultimate, irrefutable defeat of Colin Tennant. He had used his deathbed will as a weapon to ensure his wife would live out her final days in dependent poverty, a permanent victim of his absolute power. He believed that by controlling the money, he controlled the future, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the currency of legacy. He traded his family's financial security for a fleeting moment of vindictive satisfaction, unaware that he was handing Anne the key to her own liberation. By taking away her money, he removed her silence, and her voice proved to be infinitely more valuable than his crumbling estate. She stood in the twilight of her life, not as a discarded victim, but as a celebrated author, a symbol of resilience, and a completely self-made woman. She watched from a place of comfortable security as the physical remnants of her husband's empire rotted in the Caribbean sun, sold off for scrap to feed an elephant and pay legal bills. Colin Tennant had spent his entire existence trying to orchestrate the world around him, demanding that reality bend to his narcissistic will. Yet the final chapter of his story was written entirely by the woman he had tried so desperately to erase. She held the pen, she commanded the audience, and she delivered the final, undeniable verdict on the Lord of Mustique. The destruction of the Tennant legacy signaled the death rattle of a specific era of aristocratic impunity. Colin Tennant tested the limits of the establishment's willingness to protect its own, and when his wealth evaporated, so did his protection. Today, Mustique is a sanitized corporate sanctuary, aggressively remodeled to erase the chaotic footprint of its creator. Back in London, the fourth Baron Glenconner stepped into the modern world unburdened by the toxic wealth that fueled his family's nightmare. The ultimate triumph belonged to Lady Anne. By publishing her truth, she bypassed the traditional structures of aristocratic power, turning the immense pain of her marriage into universal resonance. The man who bought an island to build a monument to his own ego was ultimately outlasted by a woman armed with nothing more than her memory and a pen.